Grazie. and gentlemen, would you kindly stand for the entrance of the Right Honorable Prime Minister and Mr. Wu Ahungobo. Please remain standing for the color party and the playing of our national anthem. invite you now to observe a moment of silence. Thank you very much.
It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas on the occasion of a symposium which focuses on small island developing states and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Bahamas has made concrete efforts to respond to the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda through its National Development Plan. The Government of the Bahamas is therefore honored to host this meeting of multi-sectoral stakeholders from small island developing states as well as from the wider international community to exchange ideas on strengthening public institutions, mobilizing partnerships, and leveraging technology to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda. I wish to extend my sincere thanks to the United Nations for their partnership with the Government of the Bahamas in the hosting of this important symposium.
I'm particularly happy to welcome our colleagues from the Caribbean, but also from the Pacific. The Pacific is a long way away, and I'm glad you're here to be able to check out what the Bahamas is really like. So welcome, have a good conference, and enjoy the Bahamas.
Like all other small island developing states, we face our share of challenges. During the next 3 days, we will engage in meaningful discussions on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 objectives provide the opportunity for all of us to give focused, committed attention to addressing and possibly solving our challenges by the year 2030.
This conference is going to cover a number of important issues for countries like the Bahamas who are implementing the SDGs into their national development plans. First, we've got to think about how do we actually go about doing that, integrating the SDGs into national development plans. Next, we've got to think about how do we strengthen our public institutions to be able to assist us with implementing the SDGs. We also have to look at how we incorporate ICTs and e-government strategies into the SDGs for development.
Sustainable development in any country, particularly small island developing states, depends largely on the extent to which the public and private sectors understand the challenges facing the nation and how to work strategically and collaboratively to address them.
What we're looking for in a more modern governance is a collaborative and inclusive form of governance that's open, it's transparent, and accountable and efficient. ICT is critical in as we move the country forward, obviously, because that is going to create some efficiency through technology. And it also allows all of the government services to run off of a, hopefully what's designed as a sort of singular database.
Even though by most indication we are a wealthy nation, we face similar challenges like other SIDS throughout the world. We are a low-lying nation, so we are susceptible to sea level rise. We face high youth unemployment, and that's mainly because of our economy and the structure of our economy.
Like other small island developing states, we are dealing with a number of issues, and one of those issues is poverty. I think there's several ways that we can meet these challenges. One of the ways is to continue with the skills training, but to make sure that we match the subjects that our students are studying in school with the job opportunities that are going to be available when they graduate. Something else that's helpful is the nutritional education that will allow our people to be in their best health.
In your conversations over the coming days, I encourage you to place particular emphasis on how we can better strengthen the resilience of our small island developing states for sustainable development through effective mechanisms for risk mitigation, disaster preparedness, response, and recovery.
Welcome to the islands of the Bahamas.
I wish this symposium every success.
Having been welcomed to the entire country by the leadership, I welcome you to this opening session. As I do so, I reflect on my years at the United Nations as the permanent representative and the struggles we had in those years, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, for the acceptance of the peculiarities of small island states and the work that AOSIS did during those years. I hope that you have overcome all of those struggles. I'm about to issue an injunction that due to the length of the speakers on the program, we all govern ourselves by the minute rule. And so I do so by taking my seat and introducing to you the Honorable Kalis Rolle, the Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister for Investments.
Thank you. Right Honorable Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Perry Gladstone Christie, members of the Cabinet and parliamentarians, Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Mr. Wu Hangbo, Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Dr. Mukisa Katui, ambassadors and permanent representatives of the United Nations member states, representatives from the Caribbean community, government officials, United Nations agencies, members of the private sector, foundations, academia, civil society, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of the government of the Bahamas, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Bahamas for this very timely symposium hosted by the government with the support of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs on implementing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda by equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships. This symposium recognizes that the successful realization of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Samoa Pathway will require the participation of everyone, governments, private sector, civil society, and local communities through partnership. Partnerships are necessary to ensure we have the resources to respond effectively to issues such as climate change, move our respective countries to sustainable energy solutions, ensure that we support food security and improve nutrition for our citizens, manage chemical and hazardous waste, build our resilience to disasters, boost social development, support healthy lifestyles for our people, create decent employment opportunities for our citizens, promote sustainable tourism, and support infrastructural development across our nations. It is therefore imperative that we build partnerships that work by putting in place suitable infrastructure to ensure these partnerships are negotiated with the right counterparts, in enabling environments which allow them to operate effectively, transparently, and based on the principle of equity for the realization of the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. The team responsible for the preparation of the Bahamas' first National Development Plan, the work of the UN, and in particular the ECOSOC for its work in strengthening partnerships, the Bahamas has already begun to see the benefits and importance of formalizing partnerships to ensure sustainable funding for development and for knowledge transfer among SIDS and between SIDS and developed countries. In addition to partnerships, it is important to recognize the Sustainable Development Goals and the Samoa Pathway can only be achieved by improving public institutions. The performance of governments through their public institutions acting either as service provider or regulator have a profound impact on healthcare, education, energy services, safety, modes of production and consumption, agricultural production, environmental monitoring, and protection and disaster risk reduction. We therefore must ensure that public institutions work and are effective to realize a future where no one is left behind. Ladies and gentlemen, this symposium boasts an impressive list of speakers and participants. I therefore look forward to the opportunities it presents for us to share even more experiences and lessons on how to best ensure national development plans and policies adequately respond to the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. To engage the private sector, civil society, and local communities in implementation of the 2030 Agenda, including identifying partnership models that work. By building the capacities of public institutions, particularly national statistical offices, planning offices, and ministries to realize the 2030 Agenda. And finally, to incorporate more use of ICT in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Distinguished delegates, each of you has taken the time out of your schedule to devote 3 days on reflection for the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. Some of you have traveled long distances to attend this symposium. I thank you for your dedication to this work on policies to promote and enhance sustainable development and poverty eradication, and economic, social, and environmental sustainability of small island developing states. I wish you every success during your discussions at this symposium and in using this opportunity as a tool for networking to advance the process of implementing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. Thank you very much for your participation.
I now have the honor of introducing Mr. Wu Hongbo, Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs.
Your Right Honorable Mr. Perry Christie, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Your Honorable Mr. Kealis Roy, Minister of State in the Office of Prime Minister of Bahamas, Your Honorable Mr. Frederick Michel, Prime Minister of the Bahamas, His Excellency Mr. Frederick Shavar, President of the Economic and Social Council, United Nations, Permanent Representative of Republic of Zimbabwe to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Hamad Shiri, Chair of the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, the AOSIS, Permanent Representative of Maldives to the United Nations, my dear UN colleagues, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this symposium. I would like to thank the government of the Bahamas for hosting this event in these beautiful surroundings. With this symposium, we intend to reflect on how SIDS can take a faster track towards the SDGs and Samoa Pathway. We will reflect on 4 key building blocks of implementation. We need to reflect on how SIDS can integrate the 2030 Agenda, the Samoa Pathway, and other agreements in their national plans, policies, and strategies. We also need to give particular attention to the special vulnerabilities of SIDS, the adverse impacts of climate change and disasters, and on ways to strengthen resilience and elaborate risk-informed policies. The first building block is rethinking policies while ensuring integration and coherence. Implementing SDGs starts by adapting the targets of the 2030 Agenda to countries' national realities and priorities, and incorporating those into policies and plans. We can learn a lot from Samoa, the Bahamas, and others, which recently went through this exercise. A necessary condition for developing integrated approaches is to move out of silos that characterize policymaking and implementation. A second building block for implementing the SDGs is public institutions. Many countries are shaping and mobilizing their institutions to implement the SDGs. SDG 16 pledges to make institutions effective, accountable, and inclusive. Public accountability, ethical leadership, combating corruption, and ensuring participatory decision-making have never been more important. It is also crucial to ensure that public services improve the lives of all people. We will take stock of what have learned on how to adapt and equip public institutions for realizing the SDGs. A third building block for implementation relates to the means of implementation. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing the SDGs provides a framework for financing the SDGs. These commitments should actually be front-loaded so that progress towards the SDG can really take off. The 2030 Agenda also underscored the transformative power of technologies for realizing the SDGs. Another means to implement SDGs is partnerships. The Samoa Conference marked a turning point by including partnerships as a part of the formal outcome. A fourth building block for implementing the SDGs is statistical capacities. Statistics are crucial for countries to develop evidence-based policies and to review their own progress towards the SDGs. Many SIDS have severe capacity gaps in this regard. Last month, the first ever United Nations World Data Forum was held in South Africa. The forum, launched by a global action plan for sustainable development data. We will reflect on how to build on these commitments to harness the power of data and statistics for realizing the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, supporting SIDS is a top priority for UNDESA and for me personally as the Secretary General of the Samoa Conference. I look forward to inspiring discussions on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in SIDS over the coming days. I sincerely thank you.
I now invite His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Sarria, the permanent representative of Maldives to the United Nations and chair of AUSIS, to address you.
Harry Christie, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Bahamas, Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Honorable Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister of Bahamas, Mr. Wu Hongbo, Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, and other executive officers of the UN, my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Shawa, President of the Economic and Social Council, and permanent representative of the Republic of Zimbabwe to the United Nations, Excellencies, distinguished guests, a very good morning to you all. Let me begin by thanking the Prime Minister and the government of the Commonwealth of Bahamas and the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, for hosting this important symposium. At the outset, let me say what a pleasant it is for me to be in these beautiful islands of Bahamas for the first time. The arrangements you have made are exemplary, and your country's hospitality lives up to its world-class reputation. I've had the privilege to visit many fellow small island countries around the world. And no matter where I go, I'm reminded of home. Our small islands have so many wonderful things in common: sandy beaches, blue skies, crystal clear waters, untouched vegetation, warm and friendly people. But we also know there is a troubling side of paradise: limited economic opportunities, exposure to environmental impacts, and of course, the overarching climate change crisis. Taken together, these issues pose unique challenges to small island states achieving sustainable development. As we now often say, we can't develop sustainably unless we tackle climate change, and we can't tackle climate change unless we develop sustainably. So on that note, I would like to turn to the nexus of climate change and the 2030 Agenda, and the instrumental role small island countries have played in the development of the international response to these dual challenges, for I believe the history is instructive. Indeed, it is no accident that we led the effort to integrate climate change into the 2030 Agenda. As early as 1989, when the science of climate change was still in its infancy, and 3 years before the world would commit to addressing the crisis at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, island state representatives from around the world met in the Maldives capital, Male, for the first Small States Conference on sea level rise. After an alarming presentation by the scientists on global warming, the impacts of which many island communities were already starting to experience, the participants issued a prescient warning and called on, and I quote, "states of the world family of nations to take immediate and effective measures according to their capabilities and means at their disposal to control, limit, or reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases," unquote. The Alliance of Small Island States was formed the next year, and our efforts were central to the development and adoption of the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I was privileged to be at the Earth Summit as a young diplomat and saw the power of the Alliance firsthand. Since then, we have been working diligently to further elaborate and build on the linkages between sustainable development and climate change. Certainly, our experiences offer an invaluable lesson to the world. Out of necessity, we have had to integrate adaptation to climate change into our national planning processes and budgets while increasing portions of our resources now have to be allocated to fortifying against climate change impacts instead of being spent on education or healthcare. Events of the past couple of years alone have shown in Fiji and in Haiti and elsewhere that a single storm can erase a decade's worth of infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, by the blink of an eye. In addition to these extreme events, we must prepare our islands for slow onset impacts such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, and coral bleaching, all of which undermine the tourism industry, which is a key driver of sustainable development for many small islands. These new realities informed the development of the Samoa Pathway document and made it another landmark agreement in the effort to manage the dual challenges of climate change and sustainable development. For the first time, it entrenches the idea that climate change is a truly cross-cutting issue that impacts every facet of our sustainable development efforts in SIDS. Recognizing this in 2014 was critical to ensuring that climate change impacts on SIDS were given due prominence in the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. It was during the negotiations of the SDGs that AOSIS pushed for the inclusion of a separate goal on climate change in recognition of the critical role that climate change plays in our development planning. Even though climate change is reflected as a standalone SDG, the cross-cutting nature of climate change is also reflected through the goals on water and energy, among others. It also established the concept of durable partnerships, international cooperation across a wide variety of stakeholders, government, civil society, and the private sector, as being essential to implementing long-term solutions. Let me say a little more about what that means in practice. First, it's a very flexible model where different configurations work effectively in different contexts. Second, as we agreed in the Samoa Pathway, partnerships should be based on the principles of national ownership, mutual trust, transparency, and accountability. Partnerships to be driven by local needs and not to be imposed from outside, without sufficient engagement and consultation with those people that will be affected by projects on the ground. Third, we need to make sure that these aren't just announcements. Successful partnerships require rigorous follow-up on effective implementation. As a part of this effort, along with Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi of Italy, who has been a very good friend to the small islands, I have the honor to serve as co-chairs of the Steering Committee on Partnerships for SIDS. Already, the SIDS partnership framework has leveraged approximately 300 partnerships between UN agencies, donors, and SIDS since 2014. The aim of the steering committee will be to follow up on the commitments that have been made, to bring to the fore and showcase best practices as well as identify challenges and gaps in an effort to replicate and scale up what works. We all know that addressing climate change is vital for small islands. I'm optimistic that the partnership model will continue to be a critical and effective part of the implementation of our national development plans. What this will require is that small islands stay engaged at the international level, but also work to ensure that effective linkages are made to our national processes. I see this symposium as an important step in ensuring this happens, and I commend our hosts and organizers. The location is beautiful, the setting is perfect. It is now our turn to make our discussions most productive. I look forward to an enjoyable session. I thank you.
I'm now pleased to invite His Excellency Mrs. Frederick Masuri Makame Shaba, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Zimbabwe and President of ECOSOC, to address the meeting.
Your Excellency, Mr. Perry Christie, Prime Minister of the Bahamas, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Minister of State for Investment, Your Excellency, Mr. Wu Hongbo, Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, and all colleagues from the United Nations community and UNDESA, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I too would like to thank the Honorable Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Mr. Perry Christie, and the government and people of the Bahamas for the warm hospitality extended to me since my arrival. I am honored to join colleagues here in the Bahamas at the symposium on implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Samoa Pathway in Small Island Developing States. Equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships. I appreciate the efforts made to facilitate this important meeting and look forward to a successful outcome. Excellencies, colleagues, there can be no doubt that history will judge 2015 to be a remarkably important year for setting global development-related agendas and a triumphant one for multilateralism. Several new and ambitious agendas have emerged from that year. There is an agenda for disaster risk reduction, one for building a better world, financing and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and an agenda for arresting climate change. In each of these arrangements and agreements mentioned is made of the special case and needs of small island developing states, the SEEDs. Further, there is the Samoa Pathway, which remains the blueprint for the sustainable development of SEEDs, and it sets out the specific priorities and needs of this group of countries. I mention all these major agendas because the subject of this conference, that is equipping public institutions, is the basis on which successful implementation of any of these agendas at the national or regional or global levels will occur. Effective public institutions and policies are pivotal and indispensable for the sustainable development, and as such, all country-level efforts are essential for securing sustaining development gains. This is perhaps more so for the SEEDs, whose economic openness, small size, serves to exacerbate their challenges. And as such, it is imperative that the international community engages with this group of countries to effectively address those issues that affect us all. Ladies and gentlemen, without a doubt, effective institutions contribute to sustainable growth and poverty reduction by ensuring that resources are well managed, quality services are accessible, and development goals are met. Accountable, transparent, and inclusive institutions build public trust and reinforce social foundations. They are responsive to citizens' demands and encourage participatory planning, budgeting, and decision-making. Indeed, the Samoa Pathway emphasizes the importance of institutions throughout and requests the SEEDs to be helped, and I quote, to strengthen their national institutions to complement capacity building. The integration of sustainable development into policymaking transcends not only sectoral limits, but also local, regional, and national boundaries. Global challenges such as climate change or conservation and sustainable use of oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development require more integrated responses than can be provided by single governments or ministries. Thus, horizontal and vertical integration along different levels of government are necessary to properly address such problems. Crucially, responses must also be clearly linked to resources and to delivery mechanisms that span ministries and agencies. Further, coherent and integrated development policies must be supported by sound data and regular monitoring at the national level, the regional level, and international levels to measure impact and assess performance. This will be critical for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In this regard, the significant role of statistics is well recognized, along with increasing demands on all countries to fulfill the requirements in the Samoa Pathway and the 2030 Agenda. It is also important to recognize that there is no single best practice for institutional reform. In order to enable public institutions to develop and contribute to sustainable development, new approaches are needed that go beyond traditional technical assistance and support reforms processes that are adapted to country contexts or needs. Governments, civil society, and private sector should stand ready to support the SEEDS efforts through the effective partnerships. I fully expect that this symposium will allow SEEDS to further develop consensus on the best way forward for effectively implementing the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway at national and regional levels. And of course, the outcome of this event can be followed up in the various United Nations platforms. Ladies and gentlemen, this naturally leads me to the global platform created for the review and follow-up of the 2030 Agenda, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, HLPF. The HLPF plays a key role in monitoring and reviewing the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, including the Sustainable Development Goals. It is an opportunity for countries to discuss progress, issues, and challenges with the 2030 Agenda. The voluntary national reviews, VNRs, presented at the HLPF aim to facilitate the sharing of experiences and lessons learned among member states. They can be used to galvanize multi-stakeholder support and partnerships for the implementation of the SDGs at national and regional levels. And it is my sincere hope that following this symposium, SEEDS will be encouraged to undertake voluntary reviews to report on progress at the HLPF. This year's meeting will see SEEDS reporting, two SEEDS reporting, that is Belize and Maldives, amongst the 44 countries that have volunteered to so report. I therefore urge you all to make the most of this meeting and to share your views openly and frankly. It is my hope that we all leave this meeting reinvigorated and recommitted to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway, and to the overall goal of ensuring prosperity and a high quality of life for all. I thank you for your attention.
I now give the floor to Dr. Makisha Katui, Secretary General of UNCTAD.
The Right Honorable Prime Minister, Honorable Ministers present, colleague leaders of United Nations agencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I add my voice to expressing appreciation to the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas for hosting this important initiative, and for the members of the Caribbean community for sharing leadership with us in many areas, inspiring a lot of international action. As we sit here, I come to share in your wisdom. We are a marketplace of ideas and models that can work to scale up initiatives we've been involved in, to learn from the great wisdom that you have carried to us today. For those of us who work in the world of development economics, we always look to the Caribbean, to your proud son, Sir Arthur Lewis, the founder of development economics, in encouraging that the purpose of the state in the developing world is singularly to focus on the welfare of the citizens and building resilience. These messages are as loud and relevant today as they were when he first framed them. And more recently, the inspiring leadership from the seeds on the road to Paris COP21 demonstrated what a singular unity of purpose and voice from seeds can inspire to the rest of the world. Today, we have two directions we are moving where such inspired leadership will be necessary. One, on the road to WTO 11 Ministerial in Argentina in December this year, your concerted effort on fighting illegal fishery subsidies will be critically important in reversing the unsustainable fishing habits that we see around the world. Already we see some initiatives in this direction. The nations party to the Nauru Agreement in the South Pacific have shown that small island states can gain moral high ground on international issues. And I urge the rest of you to add your voices to this. We at the UN, in an initiative we launched in Nairobi last year at UNCTAD 14, together with FAO and UNEP, are pushing for a clear timetable of the abolition of distorting, disruptive fishery subsidies as an important contribution, particularly to small island states that are so vulnerable to the depletion of their fish stocks. Similarly, we appreciate the effort that has originally come out of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the early embracers of blue economy, that the message of sustainability and an awareness of the vulnerability, need for mitigation and recovery from shocks become part of the collective dialogue on sustainability. I'm very glad to note the diverse membership of the audience here, and I hope that inclusiveness helps to build bonds of understanding between civil society, business, public leaders, and international community in a way that does not erect sustainability as an enemy of profit, but the profit of the long term as sustainable. As civil society embraces its responsibility, we hope that the business leaders in this region and in small islands in general follows the grain today in the world of sustainable business models, aligning profits with social responsibility and environmental sustainability. Similarly, I encourage you that at a time of uncertainty in multilateralism, with a newfound wind and populism of a certain variety of tribalism in the north, nations of the south, small vulnerable economies, must find some strength in regional integration and speaking with one voice as a building block to the new and sustainable multilateralism. As I finish, I want to make assent to two brief matters. One, that we in the international community must continue to be alive to the unique vulnerabilities of small island developing countries. Just as came out clearly in Samoa, as we look to translate goals, targets into planning instruments, we must see how we mitigate the challenges of small island states graduating from LDC status, the unsustainable stock of public debt and corporate debt in many small island states, and cleaning out sustainable, viable, legitimate financial services business from the general drift of demonizing offshore financial services. I think these are challenges we owe to the small, vulnerable societies as we embrace you in a collective effort that what works for sustainability must first appear to be so doing in vulnerable small economies before we can scale it up to the larger ones. Thank you for your kind attention.
I now invite Ms. Great Farmo, Executive Director of the United Nations Office of Project Services, to address the conference.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am very grateful for this opportunity to be here and talk today, because in the end, it's all about implementation. And that is what UNOPS is about. We try to get things done. And just a few weeks ago, I met with a number of SIDS UN missions in New York and presented UNOPS's engagement in many of the small island developing states. The projects I talked about in New York were ocean related, since oceans will be the topic of the big ocean conference coming June. But we do a great deal of other projects too, not least in the SIDS. Our specialty is building and assisting in managing infrastructure. It is generally managing projects, and it is doing procurement for the benefit of countries and organizations. UNOPS stands out as unique in the UN system in two ways. We are fully self-financed. We do not receive core funding or grants, nor do we ask for it. We live off our competence, capacity, and reputation. Half of our work each year is implementation of projects on behalf of other UN entities, and the other half is done at the request of governments and financial institutions, such as, I could mention, the World Bank. We have signed an agreement with the World Bank to be drawn upon when projects come up for implementation, as we have done with other development banks as well. We also work with foundations, and in the future, increasingly also with the private sector, which wishes to invest and engage in developing countries, and who are looking for a partner to help with implementation and mitigating potential risks. The uniqueness of UNOPS is also to be found in our special ability to act with speed and efficiency. We only do implementation. We are not a policy organization. So UNOPS is all about quality, efficiency, and speed. The development needs of the SIDS, as articulated by the Sustainable Development Goals, will require massive investments in infrastructure, both soft and hard. Countries must make use of the available know-how and experience and draw on project management expertise from outside sources as well. And UNOPS use local resources and employ people locally wherever we can. When we helped rebuild houses after the Haiti 2010 earthquake, we used locally sourced materials, and 3/4 of the workforce came from the communities affected. We trained local suppliers on how to bid in tenders and meet sourcing requirements. And globally, I just want to mention this as an example. Our projects created an estimated 42,000 local working days only last week. The same number this week and every week for the remainder of the year. Another UNOPS specialty is procurement. I could mention in Honduras, where we worked with the Ministry of Health to dramatically reduce procurement costs for drugs and medical equipment. The estimated millions of dollars in savings allow the government to buy more drugs and equipment, a real dividend for the people of Honduras. In 2016 alone, the 135 low and middle income countries together spent between $2.4 to $3.6 trillion on buying goods and services. Clearly, think about it. If we only improve by a very small percentage, we will save and free up substantial resources that can be used in other ways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Our global challenge, generally speaking, is not lack of capital. The challenge in many countries is to make the commercial and political risk acceptable to investors. And I believe it is possible to do this in a sustainable manner. And UNOPS is ready to invest also a portion of our own reserves to become an enabler and partner to drive private sector investments towards the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you would like to hear more about this, I can only invite you to the session 3, where we will be discussing partnerships. We honestly do not believe it is possible to achieve the SDGs without a stronger private sector involvement, often in public-private partnerships, and typically so in many middle-income countries which do not receive much of the official development assistance earmarked for the poorest countries. I believe that UNOPS is in many ways sensitive to the special situations of SIDS. There are a number of issues that we can discuss, from resilient infrastructure design and construction to procurement, leveraging UNOPS's expertise and applying economies of scale or rapid deployment in the aftermath of natural disasters. SIDS have increased focus for many reasons, and I hope our services can be put to use in order for you to reach your development objectives. Thank you.
I'm now delighted to invite Her Excellency Desma Williams, Special Advisor for Implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, to the President of the General Assembly. Madam, you have the floor.
Good morning. Honorable Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, His Excellency Mr. Perry C. Christie, Ministers of the Government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, His Excellency Mr. U Humbo, Undersecretary General of the Department of the Social Affairs, Social and Economic Department of the United Nations, His Excellency Ambassador Frederick Musiwa Chavez, President of the Economic and Social Council, His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Chareh, Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Forgive me, I come from the very distant land of Grenada and the even more distant land of New York. I've just arrived due to duties up until late yesterday evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here and to represent the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Peter Thompson, who sends his warm greetings and his sincere apologies that he's not able to attend this very important meeting. First, allow me to thank the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas for the warm Caribbean welcome that I've received and for hosting this timely symposium. My friend, the executive director of UNCTAD, invoked the name, the spirit, and the contribution of Sir Arthur Lewis from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia. Permit me, Mr. Prime Minister, to invoke the name of the person who has best prepared me to love and to understand the Bahamas. It's a fellow diplomat, Paulette Bethel, who many of us here have worked with and who has done so much in the promotion of the name of the Bahamas and its people. When world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, they sought to put the world onto a path toward a sustainable and resilient future for people, for planet, and for prosperity. In order to ensure that the focus following the adoption of the agenda turns to implementation, the President of the General Assembly made it the priority focus for the 71st session of driving a universal push for meaningful progress in implementing each of the 2030 Agenda's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. However, key to the successful implementation of the agenda requires that we leave no one behind. No youth, no woman, no island. The 2030 Agenda has recognized and reaffirmed the special case of SIDS, and while the agenda is universal, this does not equate to a one-size-fits-all for purposes of implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. That is why we are very pleased with the focus of this symposium, as it serves as a crucial opportunity to ensure the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway, which is the blueprint for SIDS sustainable development. The need for special attention for SIDS, given their unique and particular vulnerabilities and their specific needs and capacities, have been highlighted in not only the 2030 Agenda, but also in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. SIDS were also instrumental in shaping and finalizing the landmark Paris Agreement, and they continue to play a leadership role in ensuring its effective implementation. The thrust of this symposium on equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships represents a strong willingness to take stock and to lay an essential infrastructure for the full achievement of these international commitments for SIDS. We welcome and support this initiative. Strong public institutions and partnerships that are crucial to localizing the 2030 Agenda and ensuring effective implementation of the Samoa Pathway also were foreseen in the new way that both have maintained a partnership agreement since the 2014 Third International Conference on SIDS. The solution-focused nature of the agenda and the importance of SIDS and their partners coming together to address challenges that would impact implementation is commendable. And more importantly, the opportunity for SIDS to learn from each other must be encouraged. We look forward to having the outcome of the discussions here in the Bahamas brought to continuous discussions in New York and in related places of continuing discussions. Therefore, allow me to bring to your attention 6 key events that the President will be organizing in New York that are related to SIDS implementation. These are: first, on the 23rd of March, a high-level event entitled Climate Change and Sustainable Development Agenda, in collaboration with the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, Framework Convention. This event will provide an opportunity to highlight synergies between climate change and the 2030 Agenda, and to gather governments and various stakeholders who are advancing concrete solutions that overcome a silo approach to implementation. On 18th April, a high-level Sustainable Development Goal Financing Lab is aimed at highlighting development strategies, regulatory measures, policy frameworks, and financial instruments that can be used by member states to concretely finance SDG implementation. Particular focus will be placed on financing SDGs most specifically related to people, prosperity, and planet, while cross-cutting issues including gender equality, peace, and means of implementation will also be addressed. In June, a high-level event on education to highlight ways for member states and major education stakeholders to launch a new drive for inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all, as outlined in SDG 4, will be held. The event will also elaborate how to incorporate the SDGs into the curriculum of every school in the world. The themes and timing of these events have been determined with a view to supporting preparation for other SDG-related fora, including the ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum and the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. The Office of the President is also collaborating with partners on a range of other initiatives related to each of the 17 SDGs. For example, a Silicon Valley Innovation Lab on 17th of May. Each of the above events will include a special focus, as I said already, on leaving no one behind and empowering women and girls. Together with the Ocean Conference on the 5th to 9th of June, the mandated high-level event on UN Habitat that will be held later this session, and last month's high-level dialogue on sustaining peace, these events provide a unique opportunity to secure the active engagement of all stakeholders committed to the progress of the SDGs. We hope to count on the active engagement of SIDS at these events and to bring a SIDS-focused solution to them. Allow me to reiterate in closing the message of the President that the SDGs are a game-changing opportunity for humanity, and it's a chance to pull back from the precipice of unsustainability. President Thompson recognizes the unique needs and contributions of SIDS, and Mr. Prime Minister, he looks forward to your continued engagement with his office. I thank you, sir.
I now invite Mr. Nikhil Seth, the Executive Director of UNITAR, to address the conference.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I start also with a quick word of thanks to our generous hosts, represented here by the Prime Minister of Bahamas, the Right Honorable Perry G. Christie, and the Department of Economic and Social Affairs and its Undersecretary General, Mr. Wu Hongbo. The Samoa Pathway of September 2014 was the start of a wave of UN outcomes in 2015 and 2016, and these are a part of an ambitious, though sometimes scattered, blueprint for action. Taken together, especially with the 2030 Agenda, the world has one of the most visionary and concrete long-term plans of action. Having been part of this roller coaster ride from Apia to Addis Ababa to New York and Paris, it gives me special pleasure to be here in Bahamas for the symposium to help convert our collective dreams into actions for the lives of our citizens. The focus of our symposium on equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships is very apt, for these are the two key interventions to trigger change, especially in mindsets and in mobilizing the means to make change happen. We will have ample time to discuss many of the associated issues. In my opening comments, I want to comment only on three significant challenges that lie ahead of us, challenges that have been driven home to me in moving from a career which focused on the conceptualization of big, bold agendas to a world of helping implement these agendas, especially in the SIDS countries. The three major challenges that we are going to face are first the challenge of integration, or bridging the gap between global promises and national actions. The second is the challenge of remaining on track, or the gap between long-term agendas and the constant political, economic, environmental, and social shocks which threaten to derail these long-term agendas. And the third is of equipping SIDS with tools, with capacity building, to make this a reality in the lives of citizens in the SIDS countries. Let me start with the first challenge of integration. This magical word has been used in two senses. In one sense, it is the integration of the multiple agendas. We've heard today, this morning, for example, references to Sendai, to the Samoa Pathway, to the 2030 Agenda, to the Addis Action Agenda, to COP21, 22. How can all these agendas be rolled into one national action plan? The second sense in which the word integration is used is the integration at national policy levels, to understand how a certain policy intervention is having co-benefits or negative impacts on a range of other national goals and targets. Many SIDS, especially those in Africa, have expressed concern at making all these agendas signed at different times with a specific focus part of one national plan. But it can be done, as none of the outcomes are contradictory. There are tools that have been developed in the past, like the vulnerability resilience profile, which can be adapted to serve these multiple agendas. But it is vitally important for all countries to do a gap analysis and reconfigure current plans to make them aligned and in harmony with all these great agendas that have been set in the great halls of the United Nations. The second aspect of integration is to help define the policy interventions which will best maximize co-benefits to several goals and targets, and need to build and utilize better models of the interaction between targets. Targets, some under gender equality and empowerment, some under poverty, some under oceans, some under protecting the marine ecosystems. Action on each of these targets have to be done in a way which maximizes the impact, the positive impact that one set of actions can have on the rest. Many such tools have also been developed, and national planning authorities need training to understand how the whole of government and whole of society approaches work and what should be done to make this into a working plan. For SIDS countries, often battered by geophysical and hydrometeorological events, climate change and disaster risk reduction, these are fundamental challenges. These have been mainstreamed into development thinking over the last 3 decades. All the conceptual shifts needed to permeate the consciousness of decision makers, strengthening resilience, building back better, risk-informed donor support. These are all elements of this conceptual shift in development that's been happening over the last 3 decades. The challenge is really, how do we change the mindsets of policymakers who sit in national ministries and other public institutions? The first challenge, therefore, the challenge of integration that I mentioned, is 3 parts. How to integrate multiple agendas into one national plan, how to better model risk and resilience, and how to change mindsets of decision makers. The second challenge that I mentioned is, how do you stay on track despite the shocks which set back these long-term agendas? And here, I wish that we all have the collective will to encourage and urge political leadership to work long-term and to remember the date 2030. Planning, budgets, and development assistance must not waver from a vision of the world we want by 2030. Achieving our goals for 2030 will create resilient societies. Unless we continue the investments for our long-term agenda, we will be visiting bleaker scenarios every year. Bleaker economics, briefer politics, bleaker societies, and bleaker environmental situations. There are 3 things that we need to meet this challenge: ensure that national plans and national budgets have accounted for disaster risk and climate change, create systems and mechanisms for multi-stakeholder engagement at the national level for policy formulation and implementation, and strengthen national capacity to ensure disaggregated data and evidence base for good, grounded policy. This is going to be the most difficult challenge of all. The third challenge I briefly mentioned is that of building capacity. This is a central mission of the organization I head, which is the UN Institute of Training and Research. I have worked in 2 big areas for SIDS, which is building capacity in SIDS, for building the capacity to analyze satellite imagery so that they can take stock through satellite imagery of how the situation is on coastal zone management, on coastal erosion, on rising sea levels, on unregulated fisheries. There's so many aspects of implementation and utilization of satellite imagery analysis. And the second is of building statistical capacity, where I've been working with the government of Italy, which has promised a very generous support to helping build statistical capacities in all SIDS countries based on the capacities and the needs in every individual country. But there continue to be challenges of remoteness, building a critical mass of expertise at the local level, promoting regional rather than national approaches, and locating the local expertise. These challenges have to be tackled together with different approaches, but they can be easily surmounted with the active engagement of sub-regional organizations and local universities and academia. It is with these three challenges that I close my opening comments. But in concluding, I wanted to link these three challenges to the two themes of the symposium: equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships. Public institutions have to cooperate together as never before and break from the silo mentality if the concept of integration in these two senses have to become operationally relevant. They have to work across disciplines, be able to identify trade-offs and synergies, and help in the collective task of national plan formulation and implementation. They need to be well-funded, attract the best talent, and focus on the long-term vision of the country. They also need to modernize and use the modeling tools adapted to the local situation. Partnerships need to be built around the cross-sectoral tasks facing each of the 6 countries. There is a natural tendency, and we know that, to build partnerships around thematic issues, on gender equality, on health, on oceans, on disaster risk reduction, but the SDG agenda calls for much more. Of course, the passion for individual issues is what's going to continue to guide partnerships, but we have to look at partnerships in the sense in which they were created, the conceptual thinking behind the 2030 agenda. In broader terms, nurturing partnerships which are long-term, which focus on national SDG Samoa objectives, which enable monitoring and review of progress, and which adapt and modernize using the best known practices. I end by thanking once again all those who have provided this policy and intellectual space in this symposium for us to accelerate capacity building in 6 countries. Thank you very much.
I now invite Ms. Heidi Skouras-Fox, Director on behalf of the Under-Secretary General of the UN Office of the High Representatives for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States.
Thank you very much. Right Honorable Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Mr. Perry Christie, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, Ambassadors, representatives of small island states, Excellencies, UN colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I wish to thank the government of the Bahamas for organizing, with the support of UNDESA, this very timely meeting on integrating the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. And let me also express my very sincere gratitude for the gracious hospitality and warm welcome that has been extended to us on this beautiful island of the Bahamas. I'm the Director of the Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed, Landlocked and Small Island States, and I bring you very warm greetings from Undersecretary Acharya, who unfortunately could not be in attendance here today. Among many of the functions of our office, we mobilize international support and resources for the implementation of Samoa Pathway and make sure that small island issues are mainstreamed in a coherent way across the United Nations. And we also provide support to small island states in the context of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, it has been mentioned here today already many times, a very large number of new UN processes that are addressing small island issues since the adoption of Barbados Programme of Action, which took place over 20 years ago. We recognize that this increased United Nations attention to small island issues brings also greater expectations for support. And at the same time, the resulting monitoring, review, follow-up mechanisms required pose significant burdens to many small island states, given already their quite stretched resources. So as we move forward, we need to make sure that the implementation takes place in a coherent and in a streamlined manner. Within the UN system, we are considering ways to improve our support to small islands in order to deliver on these different global commitments. And this is done, for instance, through the quadrennial comprehensive program review, which takes place every 4 years. And we just recently completed one at the end of December last year, and that review very much recognized the specific vulnerabilities of small islands and requested the United Nations entities to better integrate and mainstream the Samoa pathway fully into our operational activities. So recognizing the importance of genuine and durable partnerships in delivering the sustainable development goals in small islands, my office has also been increasing its advocacy efforts to encourage key stakeholders such as the private sector. So in order to do this, we convened in the margins of the Samoa Conference a private sector partnership forum, and also we organized together with the government of Aruba another one in 2016. And we are also planning this year to do another one, hopefully later on this year. Private sector partners have been encouraged to scale up their development solutions for small island states in areas such as renewable energy, sustainable fisheries, agriculture, tourism, connectivity, and so on. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there is increasing recognition by the international community that small island states need continued support, even as they reach middle income status and due to their vulnerabilities that do not just disappear as the per capita income rises. And currently, my office is working together with the World Bank and other partners to better define climate vulnerability and to further refine our analysis of the multidimensional aspects of small island state vulnerability in order to better understand the continuing development needs of small island states. In conclusion, I would like to stress that the Samoa pathway and the SDGs require enhanced coordination of key stakeholders, mutually agreed strategies, and cost-effective programming. It is therefore timely and appropriate that this conference aims to build greater coherence and coordination of our mutual efforts in support of small islands. OHRLS, my office, stands ready to take this journey with you and realize our common agenda for shared prosperity. Thank you very much.
It is now my high honor and great privilege to introduce the Right Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and Minister of Finance. Prime Minister, address the meeting.
I stand on the protocol that has been established, and I therefore move to welcoming all of you who have come to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and to this important and timely symposium on the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Samoa Pathway, aimed at equipping public institutions and mobilizing partnerships in the implementation of that agenda. As other speakers have noted, the Sustainable Development Goals are transformative. They provide a path by which we can preserve our planet for generations to come. The 17 goals and the accompanying targets are the culmination of important deliberations between nations. They represent a set of goals in which every country can systematically pursue. These goals focus on inclusive development, the elimination of poverty and hunger, the provision of quality education, clean water and sanitation, and the creation of a healthy, safer world. These are ambitious goals, but with focused determination and commitment, they are realistically achievable. All of the countries present here today, together with others who could not be here, have committed themselves to an aggressive agenda of sustainable development over the next 15 years. It is critical that the next steps focus on how to achieve these goals while respecting the unique needs and challenges faced by individual nations. My government, like all others here, has prioritized the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We will share a little later in the symposium our action plan, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little about governance, one of the key ingredients for a successful implementation. Good governance is critical. A properly functioning government is essential if we are to have any hope of success. We must examine our respective systems of governance and implement necessary adjustments. The success of our efforts in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is heavily dependent on having the right policies in place and ensuring effective coordination of the implementation of the change agenda. And when I talk about good governance, I'm not only talking about government's systems, I'm talking about the governance arrangements in the private sector, in civil society, and in the governmental system as well. Good governance is not the responsibility of any one institution or group of institutions. It is the responsibility of all of us working together collaboratively. The 2030 Agenda is people-focused. It places the citizen at the center of development. It recognizes that no man is an island. It is a truism that we as small island developing states know more clearly than others the challenges of independence and working in silos. We understand intimately that sustainable development requires connections and interdependent relationships. This is as true in a global context as it is at the local level as well. Again, I emphasize that sustainable development requires connections between the citizen and his or her government, between the government and the private sector, and civil society, and between other nations. We also know that when governments are not functioning effectively, nothing else functions well either. Government must be at the forefront of change, and with this in mind, my government has identified one of the key implementation steps towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the Bahamas, and that is the improvement of governance in the public sector. We have taken a number of initiatives towards reaching this goal, including looking at how we can utilize information communication technologies to increase government efficiency, inclusiveness, and engagement with its citizens and move towards an effective e-government infrastructure, reducing barriers to doing business. One of the more potentially impactful decisions taken has been the implementation of a public sector management and performance monitoring reform project. This project, created through a partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, will transform how we govern. It will reform the procurement management in government, improving transparency and providing equal opportunity to all. It will also improve the national statistical system so that high quality, easily accessible information is available to evidence-based decision-making. It transformed the public financial management to improve efficiency and transparency in the allocation of public funds and revolutionize the performance management and the implementation of government priorities. We recognize that we need modern and effective governance arrangements if we are to provide the opportunities deserved by our citizens, and if we are to interact successfully with the rest of the world as we move on with government priorities. Pioneered in the United Kingdom under the Tony Blair administration, this approach has been utilized successfully in a number of other countries, including Canada, some of the countries of Latin America. The delivery unit approach will result in the use of proactive, integrated, and centralized system to monitor all of government priorities, as well as efficiently coordinate cross-sectoral policies and stakeholder priorities. This will reduce the risk of failed projects, delays, and cost overruns, ensuring that citizens get the best use of tax dollars and facilitate the implementation of the 2030 agenda. I also want to acknowledge that this symposium comes at a time when countries around the world, and in particular small island developing states such as the Bahamas, are becoming increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Here in the Bahamas, we are experiencing more frequent and more intense hurricanes and storms, rising sea levels, high levels of vulnerability to flooding in coastal areas, and accelerated erosion of coastal zones. I think it's important for me to also indicate to those of you here that one has to have a special appreciation of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and its challenges. That we are a chain of islands spread over 100,000 square miles of ocean. The challenge to our country, therefore, is the need to duplicate infrastructure in detail. That has an enormous burden on the public treasury because there is unequal areas of development as you traverse our country. And so when you sit in New Providence, where we are now, or in an urban center as Freeport in Grand Bahama, another island, you will find different experiences qualitatively as you move to different islands. There is a compelling urgency for infrastructural development as a catalyst to economic development. And therein lies the great challenge to our country. And oftentimes when I speak to gatherings of the United Nations or to groups with the World Bank present, I raise the inequity of decision-making where a country like the Bahamas, faced with devastating hurricane impacts year after year. A year ago, Hurricane Joaquin. Well, 2 years ago, Hurricane Joaquin. Last year, Hurricane Matthew. $100 million in assessed damage, the next one $600 million in assessed damage. We were members of CRIFT. We make assumptions that we have insured ourselves. We've spent millions of dollars in paying premiums for the insurance policy. And then when we apply to collect, because of the devastation, we do not qualify to collect. It makes no sense, therefore, to a country like the Bahamas that is required to spend an enormous amount of money and for all sorts of variations in determination, wind speed, flooding, we are not qualified even though the impact on people and infrastructure is devastating. So the country, therefore, has to find the means to pay its way. And so colleagues, therefore, will have to determine whether or not it makes sense to even be a part of the insurance. And we should self-insure. And therefore, I never, ever lose an opportunity to speak to this vexing issue that faces a country like the Bahamas. And we have argued in vain that when you apply the per capita income test to the Bahamas, you are being unfair to the Bahamas insofar as our geophysical structure is concerned and the differing stages of development of our country. And this is a country that is committed to the 2030 goals of the United Nations. But we have to pause and find the means to pay our way after each hurricane impact. We were heartened when the American government indicated to us that on matters of disaster and energy reform, they would waive their policy insofar as they're contributing in the wake of such disasters or in furtherance of energy reform. But it is difficult when you have to govern a country spread over miles and miles of ocean, where you are affected, like other Caribbean countries, with a significant unemployment level amongst young people in particular, where necessarily when we sit in meetings and we discuss sustainable goals and the eradication of poverty, and you look at the challenges of governance, you ask yourself, how is it going to happen? Because on one hand, you're being urged to make the commitments to achieve those things, and on the other hand, there are administrative obstacles and tests that cause you to focus inwardly on your country, recognizing in the final analysis, you had better pay attention to the demands of your country because you have to pay your own way. And to those of us who represent people who are without jobs, families who are challenged, where you're looking at a country that predicates its economy on tourism and financial services, and you see the challenges happening in those areas. So it's a testing time where you speak and you come to a forum, but you know that the challenges when you leave here, when you finish, and you make wonderful commitments to the future, that the challenges remain for countries in their governance of being able to achieve these goals. So my advocacy is that we truly work at understanding the challenges that each of our countries face. And I speak knowing that we share a common vision with countries in the Pacific, those of us in the Caribbean. I've sat and I've heard prime ministers from Pacific Islands speak about the survivability of their country, positioning discussions where they go to certain parts of their country and there's water, when as youngsters there used to be land. We don't need any further evidence in the Bahamas that the sea will claim the land. We've had incidents of hurricanes where the water has come miles inland, and thankfully it ultimately recedes. But the question is, one day, will it? And we vividly recall the former President of the United States of America speaking in Paris, saying that islands can disappear. So I speak in a real sense of the challenges we face that are deep, and that governments are left alone to grapple with. And the great difficulty in democracies is that at some stage or the other, you have to pay attention to politics, which may be, the demands of which may be inconsistent with the policies that you should be following, because you have to win. So this is the challenge that I present to you in this symposium, that countries in our region who are grappling with the challenges in our region face. And we owe it to future generations, if not this generation, to find the formula to give them a life that they can live with dignity. One where they could aspire to be somebody in their own country, or not be faced with this extraordinary challenge that we have in being able to extract from the global economy a way of life that every country proclaims is the objective of their governance. In 2015 and again in 2016, we experienced these two intense hurricanes, Joaquin and Matthew. As I've indicated, they caused tremendous damage and loss of personal property. They also left a large number of communities displaced and caused significant damage to the country's infrastructure and natural habitat. Many of you sitting here have also witnessed similar events and have suffered the financial and social burden associated with the recovery, which adversely impacts the implementation of priority projects geared to meeting the goals of the 2013 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway. I'm happy to note that although the overarching theme of this symposium will involve discussions on how to strengthen public institutions and build partnerships for the realization of the entire 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway, the special focus will also be given to the environment and how we can better address climate change through stronger public institutions and partnerships. These experiences confirm that climate change is a pressing issue, and we can no longer refuse to take action to adapt and to militate against the effects of climate change. We must better integrate climate change, adaptation, and mitigation into all planning, educational, and budgetary processes. And we just, in the Bahamas, engaged in an assessment of our airports. And the assessment indicated that if we wanted to meet ICAO standards, and because people travel and there must be security provisions, there must be safety institutionalized, but we need $150 million to bring it all into being. These are pressing challenges because wherever people live, there's this corresponding obligation on the part of the government of the Bahamas to provide schools and health facilities and roads and airports and seaports. And I don't know if there's any country in the region that can be used to illustrate the challenges of which I speak, and for that matter, even in the hemisphere. And therefore, when we have these impacts, and God knows that we had 2 consecutive years, it could be 3, it could be 4, and there's this compelling urgency for those countries like these small island development states to focus on the challenges that exist with a view to designing strategies that will make more possible, more likely, the implementation. For countries like us, we have to challenge the bureaucracy, because decision-making is one thing, and execution and implementation is quite another. And being able to have an integrated and coordinated approach to the delivery of the services that are so necessary, we are engage in a national development plan, and I'm looking forward to that being able to significantly advance our efforts. But like many other countries, we have started this process of integrating climate change adaptation and mitigation into our national planning processes, as is reflected in the Bahamas National Development Plan Vision 2040, which will be launched in the coming months. This plan serves as a roadmap for the development of the Bahamas for the next 25 years and mainstreams the Sustainable Development Goals into its goals and strategies. By way of a conclusion, I truly look forward to the ideas and lessons that will emerge from this symposium as we move forward with the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Samoa Pathway. I truly wish you a productive meeting and a very pleasant stay in the Bahamas. And let me throw my pitch for the Bahamas. Notwithstanding all that I have said, this is one of the better places to be in the world. It is better in the Bahamas. Enjoy.
I thank the Right Honorable Prime Minister for that very moving statement, and I'm sure all of my colleagues in the UN system understand you, especially those in small island developing states. Now it remains for me to thank you very much for your participation in this opening session. I thank you for your contributions. And I ask you now if you would please remain as the head table departs.
You can smile, every smile for the man who held your hand.